Hey everyone, glad to have you here today. Today we're going to be talking about spec-driven development, and we're going to be discussing it through the lens of Conductor. My name's Jay. I'm a product manager at Google. I've been here for quite a while, and over the past few years I've been working on AI developer tools. As I'm sure you'd agree, it's been a really fun couple of years to be working in development space. I remember, it seems like yesterday, we were using hand-labeled data to train our models, and they paled in comparison to what we have today. A lot of things have changed, but one thing's remained the same. And that's designing before you build generally leads to better outcomes. Leslie Lamport said that if you don't start with a spec, every piece of code that you write is just a guess. This isn't a new philosophy. We've been using design documents and PRDs for years and years. But when generative AI came out, we started to treat LLMs somewhat transactionally rather than as architectural partners. So spec-driven development changes that. We've seen that spec-driven development leads to better outcomes internally, and we've also heard that from our developer partners as well. Spec-driven development has three main parts. First, we have the North Star. So this is setting the vision for what you're going to build or the project that you're taking on. Second, you need a source of truth. So we need to make sure that that North Star is persistent, ideally submitted alongside your code base. And then third, we need to have a process by which the AI takes that plan and implements it. And so we'll be working through all of these three things today. There are a lot of different spec-driven development workflows available today, and I encourage you to try a few of them and see which one is best for your team. They have differing amounts of structure, complexity, flexibility, capability. We designed Conductor to be a good fit for most projects. We designed it to be flexible, and I'll show you some of the ways that you can edit it so that it's a good fit for you and your team. So we'll be using Conductor to explain spec-driven development during the session, and we'll be going through 5 of the main steps that Conductor takes to help you build better. We'll go through these pretty quickly at a high level, and then we'll spend the rest of the session in the product so you can see what it feels like to use it. When you set up Conductor for the first time, you're going to be establishing that project context. So first, you're going to tell Conductor about the product or project that you're taking on. You're going to talk about your users, what goals you have, some of the high-level features, some of the brand guidelines, things of that nature. This is the highest level view. Next, we're going to be talking about the tech stack. So that's something that you can work alongside Conductor to build out, or you can tell Conductor if you already know what you want to do. And then we're also going to go through the workflow. So again, that's the process by which Conductor takes all of those specs that we've created, creates plans, and then implements. After we have that project level context defined, we can go to that next level, which is really the execution layer. So here we have 2 main components. We have the specs. These are the requirements for what you're going to build. And then we have the plan. So this is how it's going to build it. This has phases, tasks, and subtasks. When you start a new track, that's our term for a high-level unit of work, you're going to create the spec and plan, and then you can move on to the implementation phase. Conductor has a couple of unique components. First, because it's in a persistent markdown file, we have a natural save state. Conductor marks what it's working on, and you can come back at any time if you want to pause and take a break. We've also built in checkpoints, so if you ever feel like Conductor's gone in a different direction, something that you didn't intend, or if you left some ambiguity where actually you had a really strong opinion, then you can revert to a previous checkpoint. And then lastly, we built in a pretty robust review system into Conductor. So it's going to look for a few things. It'll review your code. It'll check your plan. It'll check the tracks that you've built. It'll run a suite of tests, and it'll give you a summary of what it finds. And it'll also allow you to automatically fix any issues that it finds. And so we'll see that in a few minutes. So Conductor can definitely be used by individuals, and that's its primary use case today. But it can also be used by teams, and I'd be really curious to see how you and your teams are implementing Conductor if you decide to go in that route. So I actually took this table from an internal study that we did, just copied and pasted it. Did take out the product names to be polite, but here we see Gemini CLI with Conductor against 2 different products that don't use that persistent markdown-based methodology. And we can see that, especially for complex tasks, some of these Google Cloud tasks that we have here around security, IAM, APIs, et cetera, Conductor generally leads to better outcomes. And I left the frictionful ones in for Conductor as well to be transparent about the fact that it's not a magic wand, it's not a silver bullet. Using spec-driven development or using Conductor isn't going to ensure that 100% of the time everything goes well, but generally speaking, it's going to get you much further than you would get if you were just working with the LLMs transactionally. All right, so now that we've gone through the basics, let's go ahead and jump into the product. And so when we start with Conductor, Conductor is going to introduce itself, tell us a little bit about its workflow, and then it's going to ask us to enter in plan mode. This is something that I want to note. If you're a Gemini CLI user, especially lately, you might have noticed plan mode is a new feature in the product. People ask us what the difference between plan mode and Conductor is. Plan mode is a great fit for simple tasks, maybe medium-sized tasks that don't require that more intense level of markdown-based file tracking, whereas Conductor is a better fit for longer-term projects where you may have different workflows and that maybe persist over multiple days or weeks. So here we can see that it's a greenfield project, and we're going to build a new repository to get started. And here at the bottom, it's going to ask us what we want to build. Today, we're going to keep it pretty simple so that we can stay focused on what Conductor is doing rather than on the complexity of the project implementation. So we're just going to make a timer for task logging. So now we're at our first step, which is creating that product.md file. And you'll notice here at the bottom, we have a couple of options. We can go through an interactive Q&A session with Conductor. So it'll try to bring up relevant questions to help us create this file. If we're building a quick prototype or we don't want to do that, we can just auto-generate it. So it'll just do its best, and then we can review that and make edits directly. Or we can paste information in if we already know what we want to say here. And so for this, we'll go through the interactive sessions for all of these so you can see what it looks like. I'm not going to go through each one of the potential answers, but I will touch on some of the topics so you can see kind of what it's asking about and how it's coming up with the content that it's creating. So for the product.md file, this again is that highest level project file that we're creating. And here we have it asking us about the target audience, some of the core features that are going to be in the product, what platforms we want to launch on, and data storage. So this is a good example of where data storage may have secondary implications on the user experience and the tech stack. So it's going ahead and asking us about this early on in the process. So we'll review that, accept all of that information. It's going to give us a summary of what it created. Again, this is pretty simple, but you can imagine for your projects, it might be much more complex. We'll go ahead and click Approve. And now you'll see in the top left-hand corner, we have that product.md file created and ready to go. And now we're going to move on to product guidelines. This is more similar to brand guidelines. This is going to be the look and feel of the project. So we have UX principles, branding and tone, some of the visual aesthetic components. It's going to be asking us about accessibility as well. And we can review that information, answer those questions, create that file. And now we have product.md and product guidelines up there on the top left-hand corner. And so we'll now move on to the tech stack. And it's going to be asking us about the language, the front-end frameworks, some of the styling. And here's a good example of where it's already taking into account some of those previous questions that we answered because it has that context. And so we already told it we wanted to use local storage, and now it's asking us about which local storage solution we want to use for implementation. And so for this, we'll actually say that we want to make a change, just so you can see that it's an iterative process with Conductor. So we'll change our minds, and actually now we want to use a different local storage solution. So it'll come back to you and provide some other options that you can go with. And I really like that it gives an explanation of what each one is and some of the pros and cons. And if we wanted to go even deeper, we could be asking it more questions about these to come to the right solution. But now we'll approve that information, and now we have our tech stack, our product guidelines file. And Conductor automatically will help you pull in some code style guides so that you have the highest quality code possible. You can just bring in the recommended code style guides automatically, or you can select them individually if you'd like. So we'll go ahead and pull those in. And now we get into a part that I really like. So this is the workflow component that we talked about earlier. So this is the process by which the AI is taking all of that information and going through the implementation. So we'll use the default workflow, but it will ask a few questions for us to customize it if we'd like. Things about test coverage, how often we want to commit. That's something that we've seen people be very passionate about choosing a preference there. How we want to provide summaries. But I'm actually going to pull back the curtain and show you the workflow file itself to give you a better sense for how we're instructing the AI and how you might be able to customize it on your own. And if you're already a Conductor user, if you want to mess around with it, I highly recommend that you go into this file, review it with you and your team, and see how you might change it to be the best fit for your projects. So here at the top, you can see that we're giving it some of that core understanding of how to focus and how to prioritize. We want to focus on the plan. We want to make sure that it knows that the tech stack is a deliberate choice. We want it to think about user experience first. And then we get into that standard task workflow on line 16. So this is how we direct it to select the task. We're using test-driven development by default, so it's writing those failing tests, et cetera, et cetera. If we scroll down in that file, we get to some interesting content on how it determines whether the phase is complete. So we can see that it's ensuring that that test coverage is looking good. It's looking for any debugging steps that it may have missed. Here we have the quality gates under that phase completion. So obvious things like all tests pass. But also, if you look at line 148, it's updating the documentation if it needs to. And so that's one interesting piece about spec-driven development that I'm really interested in personally, which is how do we keep the specs updated as we're building in order to use them as a persistent source of truth for what we have built, and so that I can build it more effectively moving forward. And so that's a step that we've built into the Conductor process. We also can customize our testing settings if we want, and also our deployment steps. But for today, we'll use the default workflow guide. And now we have finished that project level work that we needed to do in order to get started. And so that's not something that you're going to need to do every time. That's going to be something that you only need to do once per project. And then you can continue using that as context for many features and bug fixes that you need to do subsequently. And so now that we have that project level context defined, we can dig into that first level of features that we want to build. And so it's going to start asking us about the requirements. So here we'll go through the requirements that we have for our first feature set. So it's going to be asking us about user stories, some of the functional requirements, some of the non-functional requirements, some of the constraints. I'll pause here. This is a bit interesting. So here it's asking us, do we want to keep this very constrained? Do we want to make just a core MVP to get the initial functionality up and running? Do we want to provide any other constraints? I personally, when working with Conductor, spec-driven solutions, like to start with getting the underlying framework built out and working successfully, and then you can add additional tracks, aka additional features on top of that once you get the core components built out, especially for complex projects. So now we can review that information. Again, we could do 10 or 20 more questions if we want to continue building that out, but for the purposes of time today, we'll keep it short and sweet, and we will approve that. And now it's going to be suggesting that track that we mentioned earlier. So it looks at the information that we've defined, it suggests a track name, and we can go ahead and click yes. And it's going to take all of that information and build out what it thinks is a good implementation plan. So we have a few different phases here, tasks and subtasks. And you see we have these empty checkboxes where Conductor is going to start tracking what it's working on at any given time, and then tracking things as it completes them as well. All right, so now that we have our plan, we have our spec, we have that project level context, we can start with implementation. So here's an example of where Conductor is marking the current track that's currently in progress. And it's going to pick off some of these initial tasks. So this one's just the project initialization. As we continue working through the tasks, we can see that now it's like setting up those tests that we talked about earlier. And we're going to skip a lot of the implementation components. We all seen what it looks like for AI to code. But I do want to pause on some of the checkpoints that it provides, because I think that's particularly interesting, and it's a part of Conductor that I particularly like. So here it's asking to run the automated test suite because it's completed that first phase. And so we can allow that. And it runs a test. This one was pretty simple, but you'll see in subsequent phases we may have more tests. And then it also provides a manual verification step. So optionally, we can go in and ensure that everything is looking good based off of what we want to see so far. So I use Gemini CLI. I use lots of other tools. And this is something that I personally like. Sometimes when I'm just vibe coding a project, it feels like it can go off and run a little bit too far before it checks in with me to see whether it's actually doing the thing that I want it to do. And so I think when you compare vibe coding, hand coding, and using something like Conductor, I like the iterative process here because it's checking in with me, and then I can say, actually, no, I kind of wanted to go in a little bit different direction. And we're doing that before it gets way too far in the process. It feels a bit more natural. So this was just the project scaffolding. So this is the manual check that it asked us to do right here. So we can continue on. Yep, looks good. It's working fine. Now it's going to start building out that timer engine component. And we'll skip forward through the implementation. It asks to run some tests. Here, there's no UI to check, but it did run 7 tests on its own, and those all passed. And so we can continue on. And here, we're at the end of phase 3. So we're starting to actually see some of the UI being implemented. Again, it's giving us instructions on how to test that. So we can pull that screen up, see the timer's working. Again, very simple example, but you can imagine that if you were building a more complex website, you could see it being built out in phases over time, which would be really useful. And then we have our last phase, making sure that we have that logging component that we asked for at the beginning of the experience. And so it's going to run that test suite on that last phase, ask us to check. We can see now we can actually save the task that we're working on and track that over time. And that first track is now complete. And so future tracks could be additional functionality. It could be more complex features. We could be adding login. We could be adding some more UI to the page, et cetera. So that's how I would think about tracks is individual units of work that you want to see before kind of moving on to the next step. Now that we've completed the track, we can make some updates to the tech stack. So I mentioned that circling of the loop earlier, that closing of the loop. And here, now that we've made some implementations and made some changes, we want to make sure that the tech stack file reflects that so we can continue to use that as correct project level context for all of our future features and tracks that we implement. So we'll say yes, great, let's go and include those changes. And now we're ready for the review step. So it's going to run a review, and this one can take a little bit of time sometimes, but I enjoy how thorough it is. And so here at the top, you can see that it was checking the plan, it's checking all of our style, running a number of tests, and it found a few small issues here that it thinks could be improved. These are all prioritized, so we can see a couple of low items and one medium item, and it will offer to automatically go ahead and fix those issues. And so we'll say, yes, sounds great, let's do it. And then lastly, now that the track is fully complete, we're ready to go. We can archive that. So we're retaining this context in our files, in the Conductor folder, so that we always know what we had previously implemented and can use that as future context. So we've gone through the 5 steps that Conductor takes to help you build better. And I hope that you'll see that instead of this being a time-consuming process that feels like more work, it's actually a worthy investment because we're front-loading a lot of that thinking rather than doing it later on in the implementation phase. As we all know, it's much cheaper to make changes and make decisions when you're in that planning stage rather than when you're well into the implementation phase. And although we had a simple example here, I want you to think about this from the context of the really difficult trade-offs and decisions that you as product managers and engineers are going to need to make when you're working on complex code migrations and building out really powerful products. And those are things that the system will benefit from you thinking about before you get into the implementation. So as we look towards the future, right now we're kind of in this first category of spec-driven development. And that's the name of the talk, obviously. And we're kind of building towards spec-anchored development. So what's the difference here? Spec-driven development is when you have a spec, you build from it. You generally don't visit that again after the implementation is complete. The next step, which we're building towards, is spec-anchored development, where we have that implementation complete, we have that spec file, but we continue to reference it as an artifact to help guide the AI afterwards. And this is just my personal take, so maybe not approved by my leadership. But I think we're eventually going to get to a point of spec as truth as a system that a lot of teams use. And so this is where the code and spec are kept in sync at all times. And a lot of the changes can actually be managed directly through the spec. And if you had told me we'd be doing this like a year or two ago, I would have said you were crazy, but the models are getting so good that I really do think we're going to get there in the next few quarters or year or so. And it'll be really interesting to see how tools develop, how processes and workflows like Conductor develop in order to enable that future. And it's something I'm really grateful to be working on, and I hope you all enjoy testing as new features and opportunities come out. And I'm already seeing some teams start to do this internally, which I think is generally a good sign that we're going to see some traction in that area. For example, there's a team that we work with that runs a script on a weekly basis in order to make sure that their specs are kept up to date with their code. And they found that the AI is much more accurate because of that. That's a tough thing to evaluate today. I also work on AI evals. And so I hope that next year, if I come back, I can have more data to support that. But we're seeing good progress there and a lot of quality improvements. So I'll leave you with one parting thought, which is that as specs become a more important part of the way that we develop, it's causing changes in how we work. As product managers, we're getting further along in our ability to build out prototypes and sell a vision. And engineers are being asked to go further into their product thinking. And I'm really enjoying that process. I think it's fun to see these different fields start to meld and merge. But one thing seems to be remaining the same, and it's that deciding what to build and agreeing on the best way of building it is by far the most important value that we can provide in this new world where AI is doing a lot of the tougher code that we may not want to spend time on, or that's taking up some of our time. So I think that the Conductor and tools like it are a great use case of helping us work with the LLMs, work with generative AI models as architectural partners, and to fully take advantage of their capabilities while also bringing all of our expertise into account. And so with that, we'll end the talk, and if you could give some feedback, we would really appreciate it.